Good afternoon and welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives to hear Nick Brokausen talk about his new book, We Few, U.S. Special Forces in Vietnam. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here, whether you're here in the theater or joining us on our YouTube station, and a special welcome to our friends at C-SPAN. Today's program is part of a series of discussions, films, programs, lectures, and other events related to the Remembering Vietnam exhibit upstairs in the Lawrence F. O'Brien Gallery. Before we bring up Nick Brokausen, I'd like to tell you about two other programs that are coming here later this week. Tomorrow night at 7 p.m., join us for a bipartisan discussion about how citizen movements have influenced policymakers. In a program called Citizen Engagement in America's History, citizen activists will join a panel with former members of Congress to discuss civic engagement, civic education, and how to petition the government. Then on Thursday, June 21st at noon, as a Robert F. Kennedy Legacy Program, we'll hear from Carrie Kennedy about her new book about her father, Robert F. Kennedy, Ripples of Hope. Using interviews with those who have been inspired by him, Kennedy brings to life RFK's values and passions, and a book signing will follow that program. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events online at archives.gov. There's a sign-up sheet outside on the table, also where you can get email updates. You'll also find more information about National Archives activities and events. And another way to get more involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities, and there are applications for membership in the lobby. Now I'll ask all Vietnam veterans or any United States veteran who served on active duty in the United States Armed Forces anytime during the period November 1st, 1955 and May 15th, 1975, to stand and be recognized. Veterans, as you exit the McGowan Theater after today's program, National Archives staff and volunteers will present each of you with the Vietnam Veteran lapel pin. On the back of the pin is embossed, "A grateful nation thanks and honors you." United States of America Vietnam War Commemoration is a national initiative, and the lapel pin is the nation's lasting memento of thanks. As I mentioned earlier, this program is related to our special exhibit, Remembering Vietnam. For this exhibit, our curatorial staff combed through National Archives records here and across the country to find documents that tell the stories recounted in the 12 episodes of the exhibit. These records come in many forms: typed reports, photographs, audio recordings, motion picture film, and videotapes and artifacts. Remembering Vietnam traces the long arc of the war from the decisions that led to increased American involvement to the eventual withdrawal of the United States troops. But it also brings us face to face with individual stories of the people who lived, fought, and died in Vietnam. In We Few, Nick Brokausen brings us some of those stories from the perspective of one who served and fought side by side with them. His small company and its indigenous allies were the backbone of ground reconnaissance in Vietnam during the war. Let's hear from him now and learn the stories of those men and the hardships they faced. Nick Brokausen served 17 years in the U.S. military. After his time in the Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observation Group, he participated in missions as diverse as being part of mobile training teams sent to countries in Africa and South America, and later within the divided city of Berlin, and as a member of the 1st Counterterrorist Unit in the U.S. military. Since leaving the military, Nick has built several businesses that provide training to law enforcement and military, as well as consulting for the resource development community. He's developed business interests in software and cybersecurity, waste to energy and power plant projects, as well as products such as the ballistic shield used by law enforcement and armored vehicles. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Nick Brokausen.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll make this as short as I can, so we can get into the questions and answers and that. I'd like to say I wrote this book as a catharsis. I went to a period of my life where things had slowed down somewhat, and I wanted to get some of my demons done away with. So I sat down and I wrote this book in about 6 months. And then it sat around for 2 years, and then finally I had a publisher, a small publisher, picked it up and printed it back about, I think it was 15 years ago or 10 years, something like that. And then it was been out of print for 10 years, and it's just been republished by Casemate. I'm not a scholar. I'm not an archivist. I'm just a guy that went through this and decided to put it down on paper in the hope that people after me would understand the incredible courage of my peers. It's not Sergeant Rock and the Howling Commandos. There's not a lot of me. I'm more of the narrator in it rather than the central figure. But I wrote the book as a tribute to my peers. And I'd like to read something to give you an idea of exactly what I'm talking about. This is the Presidential Unit citation that was awarded to Mac V. Sog. And I was actually privileged enough to be at that ceremony in Fort Bragg with about 300 other survivors of Mac V. Sog that were there, including several generals that were retired as major generals that had been staff sergeants and buck sergeants in those days. So I'll read this if I can. I'm not a professional reader either. So. The Presidential Unit citation for extraordinary heroism to the United States Studies and Observations Group, United States Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. The Studies and Observations Group is cited for extraordinary heroism, great combat achievement, and unwavering fidelity while executing unheralded top-secret missions deep behind enemy lines across Southeast Asia. Incorporating volunteers from all branches of the armed forces, and especially U.S. Army Special Forces, Special Operations Groups, ground, air, and sea units fought officially denied actions which contributed immeasurably to the American war effort in Vietnam. Military Assistance Command Vietnam Special Operations Group reconnaissance teams composed of Special Forces soldiers and indigenous personnel penetrated the enemy's most dangerous redoubts in jungle Laotian wilderness and the sanctuaries of eastern Cambodia. Pursued by human trackers and even bloodhounds, these small teams outmaneuvered, outfought, and outran their numerically superior foe to uncover key enemy facilities, rescue downed pilots, plant wiretaps, mines, and electronic sensors, and capture valuable enemy prisoners, ambush convoys, discover and assess targets for B-52 strikes, and inflict casualties all out of proportion to their own losses. When countermeasures became dangerously effective, Special Operations Group operators innovated their own counters, from high-altitude parachuting, halo, and unusual explosive devices to tactics as old as the French and Indian War. Fighting alongside their Montagnard, Chinese, Nung, Cambodian, and Vietnamese allies, Special Forces led hatchet forces, companies, and platoons staged daring raids against key enemy facilities in Laos and Cambodia, overran major munitions and supply stockpiles, blocked enemy highways to choke off the flow of supplies to South Vietnam. Special Operations Group cross-border operations proved an effective economy of force, compelling the North Vietnamese Army to divert 50,000 soldiers to rear area security duties, far from the battlefields of South Vietnam and South Vietnam, period, sorry. Supporting these hazardous missions were Special Operations Group owned United States and South Vietnamese, pardon me, page turn, Air Force transport and helicopter squadrons, along with Air Force forward air controllers and helicopter units, and the U.S. Army and U.S. Marine Corps. These courageous aviators often flew through heavy fire to extract Special Operations Group operators from seemingly hopeless situations, saving lives by selflessly risking their own. No truer statement can be said. Special Operations Group Vietnamese naval forces, instructed and advised by the U.S. Navy SEALs, boldly raided North Vietnam's coast and won surface victories against the North Vietnamese Navy, while indigenous agent teams penetrated the very heartland of North Vietnam. Despite casualties that sometimes became universal, Special Operations Group operators never wavered, but fought throughout the war with the same flair, fidelity, and intrepidity that distinguished Special Operations Group from the beginning. The Studies and Observations Group combat prowess, martial skills, and unacknowledged sacrifices saved many American lives and provide a paragon for American forces' future special forces. That was the presidential unit citation that was given to the unit. When I wrote this book, there were only 2 other books out at the time. One was written by David Maurer, which was a fiction account called The Dying Place. And it was based on his experience at the same unit I was in, CCN. And the other was a scholarly work by a gentleman named John Plaster, who had been at CNC Central and ran recon and later was a cubby rider in that. Most of the people that John Plaster tried to interview refused to speak to him, as myself did when he first started writing the book, because these missions were classified. And as far as we know, they were still classified. So a lot of the information in John's book he got from 1 or 2 people that were willing to talk to him. And as in all cases, eyewitnesses, every one of them has a different view of the same incident. So there were things that were left out, little inaccuracies. So, but today, more and more authors are coming forward and writing about special projects. John Meyer has written 2 really fine books, and there's Toby Todd, I think a couple of the others. So I laud them in their efforts to come forward and tell people about our peers. I didn't write this for myself. I wrote it for the guys I was there with. The most incredible people I've ever met in my life, all of whom are still friends of mine. And I treasure them deeply. I hope that the book gives you an idea of what it was like to be there in that time. It's not a scholarly work. There's a lot of profanity. It's the viewpoint of someone who was there at the time, who witnessed it at the time and had the impressions of that time. I think it pretty well details what it was like on some of the missions. There is a sequel that I worked on at the same time in that will come out after that, which details the last part of my tour in special projects. But I hope that if you get the book, that you enjoy it. I hope that you learn something from it, that it doesn't offend you, but at the same time that you get a feel for what we went through and why we went through it. So I can take questions now, if that's all right. Thank you.
Folks, if you have questions, please go to the microphones.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. Curious if you talked about it one time someone came to you and asked you a bunch of questions and you thought things need to stay classified at that time. What were some of the things, I guess, that we'll all find out if we read your book that you needed to, I guess, get cleared so many years after you experienced them? What kind of things have opened up or have become less classified?
I never got clearance when I wrote the book. I wrote it. It was 15, 20 years ago was when I wrote it. And there were things that, that I still don't talk about. So portions of what we did and some of the target areas, I'm sure are still sensitive because of the particular country they were in or a location in that. And there were other aspects of that we still don't talk about because they're classified, I'm sure. But as far as the techniques and the way we operated, and I had a good friend of mine to give you an idea of the complexity. When we were young staff sergeants and buck sergeants and young lieutenants, we were running operations, joint combat operation, combined arms, directing air support on the ground. You're running a combat mission. You're running to save your life. At the same time, fighting to get out with the information you got in there with, or went in there for. Today, one of our guys went all the way to Major General, and he was instrumental in the Operation Anaconda in Afghanistan. And somebody asked him, said, aren't you afraid of the danger you're putting these young men in? And he said, when they're in as much danger as I was in Laos, I'll feel, comfortable that they're doing their job. So it was challenging, but it paid off in the end.
Do a follow-up, thank you. What would you describe, I guess maybe, and again, it's probably in your book, and just maybe you could touch on it, a path that you joined the service and the type of people that go into special projects. How do they raise their hand or have their hand raised for them to go down those paths that you were involved with versus other divisions of the military?
Have you heard the term Shanghai?
Yes. Okay.
I had people ask us, even current special forces guys, go, what kind of training and selection course did you go through to get into special projects? Blackmail. You had to be a triple volunteer, first of all. You had to volunteer for special forces. You had to volunteer for Vietnam, and you had to volunteer to be in projects. At any time, you could quit. I mean, that was the underlying, and we had people that actually quit. And to this day, there's no stain on their manhood or anything because this was about as high pressure as you can get. The only thing that comes close to it, I think, is being over 70 because every day you could be your last one. So it's something that some of you recognize. But as far as special selection, we ran a 1-0 course in Long Ton. 1-0 was a recon team leader. That was the code selected for it. And 1-1 was his assistant, 1-2 was his assistant, etc. And we actually ran a school in Long Ton, Vietnam, that was run by former 1-0s that had run missions. And you could go from running missions down to Long Ton to be an instructor. I never saw that happen, but they said it was possible. And the actual last exercise is an actual mission in War Zone D, where they put you in on the ground and you've got a lane grader there to speak, and you're live fire. You're going to run into somebody out there, carrying an AK. And the whole idea was train you to survive and to think. We became masters of Plan B. That's the one that when Plan A fails, you pull out of your back pocket and start working it out. But other than special selection for special forces, there was no real selection to get you into special projects. You were told when you got to the project, you can be in the hatchet company, and you can be in recon company, and you can be in support. and recon was the only one that was voluntary. I think something else that most people don't understand, at the height of the war, Special Forces only consisted of about 3,500 people worldwide. So we were a small, compact group in essence in the beginning. And then Special Projects became even smaller and more compact. I saw a statistic one time of the 7,800 men that served in ground combat operations. There's a difference. It's not staff, ground combat operations. Guys that actually ran on the ground. Only about, I think, 1,800 of us survived the war. So, I mean, we lost 18 teams that disappeared without a trace. That's usually 8 men apiece or more that vanished off the face of the earth. And even more that were decimated. Each one of those recon companies consisted of between 30 and 50 Americans. You had supposedly 18 teams that were available, but you had teams that were so shot up that they couldn't go back out. They needed to recruit new people, train new people up, get back in shape to get back on the roster. So towards the end, in 70, 71, and 72, you're running more missions because there are less teams, because the war had changed by then. You know, we stopped being a reconnaissance unit and actually became bait. Get out there, stir them up, make them come up on the radio, and we'll send in the B-52s while they're getting a pedicure and bomb the place in the dust. So I hope I answered your question, didn't ramble on too far.
Nobody else seems to. I'll go for another one. Thank you very much. You mentioned locals in the area and relying on them. And today in the theaters, we've got issues, obviously, trying to build up trust. And in some cases, that trust failed. What was some of your experience with some of the areas that you participated in and being able to rely and trust the locals that you would rely on for support and involvement in some of those missions?
I think the best thing to show you on that is I've worn this. It's a Montagnard bracelet. John Wayne wore one all the time. And I will be Brew until the day I die. The Montagnard and the Nungs and the people we worked with, you became a warrior in their tribe. And the fidelity that they served with, I mean, I've had yards lay on top of me to keep me from being wounded again. Some of the most dedicated, hardcore fighters you'll ever find. And they were essentially an Iron Age tribe, and then we trundled into the country and started handing out, man jewelry, new rifles, new mortars and all that. They adopted to it like ducks to a water. The Chinese Nungs, pretty much the same story. The Vietnamese and the Cambos, the other ones we use. And we use mostly, up at north, we use mostly Montagnards from the Brew, Sedang, and the Rade tribe. We had a few Jurai, but they're a small tribe anyway. And Nons, and some Vietnamese. Oddly enough, most of the Vietnamese were recruited out of prison. And they were good recon people, I mean, hardcore. They were in prison for, robbery, bank robbery, whatever, and we went down and recruited them out of there, and they got a chance to work their sentence off at the same time. That wasn't a prevailing thing, but it happened in a couple of occasions. I actually recruited my thump gunner, M79, was a former North Vietnamese sapper officer. He was in the POW camp next door. I recruited him out of the POW camp because he was a Brew Montagnard, and the other Brew knew him, said, he wants to come out and work with us, and if they trust him, I was going to trust him. To this day, we betrayed the Montagnards in the end. Not us, but the government. They basically, when they signed away our POWs and signed away, all the other stuff in the agreement with the North Vietnamese, they basically gave the North Vietnamese license to do what they wanted to do, which was destroy the Montagnard people. And they were the victims of the Yellow Rain. They were the victims of out-and-out genocide after the war. I went back after the war, and a lot of the little people that we had, they'd had their arms cut off because most of them had SU, S-C-U, tattooed on their forearm, and that, which means Special Commando Unit. And anybody found with that tattoo, they'd chop it off right above it. And a lot of them went through the re-education camps afterwards. And a lot of them went back up in the hills. A little footnote there. At the end of the war, we knew pretty much what they were going to sell out the yards. The Vietnamese weren't going to be able to hold, and if they did, they wanted to get rid of the yards too. So we were arming them. And I don't mean a pistol here and a couple of cartridges there. When the big American units were pulling out, they left stacks of ammunition and weapons and that behind, especially up at Quan Tri at where the 5th Mech was. And we took it en masse and took it up and gave it to the yards in the hope they'd be able to survive afterwards. They're a warrior nation. They've been that way for centuries. It's not in their oral lore. They actually have a memory of, in stories about hunting elephants with long hair. So originally the Montagnard people, the Dagan, came from an area in China and were gradually pushed south through the centuries until finally they ended up in the mountains of Laos and Vietnam. So they're very, very interesting people. I still hold them very close to my heart. Any questions? Yeah.
This is a little outside the scope of your book, but you served in a special operations unit for counterterrorism in Berlin. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Are you the sniper in the crowd? Yeah, okay. Thank you. Let's see, Dead A. Well, you have to first understand about special projects people. When I came back from Vietnam, I went to I think it was the 6th Special Forces. And I arrived on a Friday. I got an interview by the B, actually at that time it changed from B teams to company sergeant major. He says, come back Monday, and the old man wants to meet you, the company commander. Well, I came back Monday, and he goes, you're gonna have to find a new job. I said, why? I said, well, the company commander doesn't want you. I said, why? He said, well, everybody knows, Sarge, that people from projects are either alcoholics or psychos, and apparently you're sober. So I had to find a new job. And my brother-in-law, he'll pay for this too, he was the adjutant. He'd been in Vietnam with us. In the book, he's known as Captain Psycho. But he was the adjutant in the Test Special Forces group, and he was filling up the 10th because it was expanding at the time. And virtually everybody else that didn't want special projects people, he got them up at the 10th group, and it became the core of the 10th Special Forces group. Well, the 10th Special Forces group has a separate unit that was always associated with it, which was Detachment A in Berlin. And Detachment A was start hissing if I wander into sensitive areas. Stayskull wrote a book about Berlin, but it was a stay-behind unit, basically. When the balloon went up and the Russians came through the Fulda Gap, we were supposed to blend into the local population, and using hidden caches of weapons and money, gold coins, we were supposed to start a resistance movement, to tie up, do this, basically the same thing we did in Vietnam, was, destroy their logistics chain, because everything moves by rail with the Russian army, and the biggest rail yard in Eastern Europe was in East Berlin at that time. That was one of the particular areas of interest in that. And oddly enough, most of the people that were in Dead A were former special projects people. They had gone there, you had to speak German or speak a foreign language to get there. And then, and you had to have a top secret clearance to get in there. And it was pretty much the same thing. You're 12-man teams. You had a different mission. Some things match, some things don't. But that unit participated in both of the Iranian hostage attempts, rescue attempts. People from Dead A. And then they had the mission of, also intelligence gathering and, in the case the balloon went up, performing other functions for the Army. And there's, you look at the numbers today, there's 60,000 or 80,000 special operations troops in that. Where are they at? They're out, they've included a lot of people like the Rangers and the SEALs in that category and that, but there's still a lot of people out there doing essentially the same thing. You would come back from Vietnam and you might go on a mobile training team to Bolivia to work with the Rangers in the mountains as a radio operator because they couldn't transmit, and we were using single sideband ground wave propagation to actually communicate. And they were actually hunting down what they call bandits in those days, but it was actually the Sendero Luminosa that eventually evolved into. So it was, you ended up doing different jobs in different places for different bosses, but still pretty much stayed special forces. Yes.
Nick, would you be able to describe one of your actions that's not classified?
You've been talking to my ex-wife? Yeah, sure. What's a good one? You mean in Vietnam, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, for example, we do, I think it's in the beginning of the second book, we did wiretaps. And the first wiretap machine we got was god-awful big. I mean, it's huge. It was, a tape recorder like that with a reel-to-reel on it. And they miniaturized it down to, finally got it down to about that big and about that wide. But the problem was the tapes. They were normal speed. You had to change the tapes every 4 hours, which meant crawling back down to where you put the wiretap in, change the tapes, recamouflage it, get out of there without bruising any of the vegetation. And then they came out with a new system that you could actually do coaxial cables, which the North Vietnamese used a lot of, as well as the regular, comma wire setups and that, and which was much better. So we get a wiretap mission, it's the first one I've ever run with Mac. And I go down, I go to supply, and I draw the wiretap equipment, get the tutorial on it, sit down, work it through, talk to a couple other guys from another team that actually done a wiretap about a month before that. And at that time, we were trying to find out two things. How in the hell they were getting fuel down south without hauling it in 55-gallon drums. And eventually, we found out they had a pipeline that they were resupplying when all those T-64 and T-54 tanks that wheeled out of the jungle when they finally took the country. They were all down south, and another team had gotten pictures of them. The Soviets used 55, or actually not 55, but they looked like 55-gallon drums on the exterior rear of the T-54 or T-54. So they extend their range. Well, they weren't using that. I mean, they had to have fuel somewhere. So we were going in, wiretapping, trying to find cable, trying to find out where their fuel dumps were. And that was our mission, actually, to go in and they'd try and do a wiretap in that area because they knew that the troop concentrations were right for us to actually find the major headquarters. So anyway, we go in. I got the thing set up in that, and my the Montagnards and my 1-0 and my 1-2 are behind me about 30 yards, kind of up the slope in that. We had found a trail juncture where it came down and forked off to the west on the side of this old caldera that was all overgrown and that. We knew that there was probably about a division plus in that area. So we found the wire, we put the tap on, and I'm laying there. I've got to go back down and change the tap now every 24 hours, which is much better. So the next morning, at about 6, I'm down there. I crawled down, you go moving real slow, because you don't want to, the North Vietnamese used wire walkers, trail watchers, that would walk the trails, walk where the wire is, and looked for, they had a machine that detected load loss, so they knew if you had a tap on it. So anyway, I'm moving real slow. I'm down there. I'm putting the tape in, and I hear 2 clicks on the emergency radio, which means somebody's coming. So I'm laying there trying to look as small as I can, and here comes about 25 North Vietnamese and sit down and start giving a call. Well, first 2 guys came up with a detection device, one of those electromagnetic coils and that detects load loss and that. And they went away, and then they came back with about 25 troops in that, and they started giving a class. This is the M1A1 wire detecting device, and they got this guy droning on, and I'm laying there sweating bullets. I'm only about, I think the nearest one is about where the cameraman is. And they're kind of sitting up on this slope and that, and I just know one of them's going to see me out there. So I'm sweating bullets and that, and I hear this, typical thing that some NCO yelling at somebody, right, and in Vietnamese. And then I hear a slapping sound, and then a little bit more talking, and the whole group moves off. Now I get back up top, and I'm asking Mac what happened. He said, well, 3 of them were sleeping in the back row, and one of the NCOs went back there and jacked them up. And so, God, I can't believe they didn't see me. I'm right out there. And he said, we decided to move the tap, which was good. We just removed the tap, and it pulled back up to move out in another direction, and that when here they came back. And they came back with 40 guys that were not there for a class. They were looking for us. So they had seen something, or the tap had been given away or whatever. Well, yeah, that's right, we were going to leave it there. And we left a toe popper underneath it. So the device was still there, and we were going to leave it. We were going to put another one up the trail and that, come back and see if this one, and they found it, and it went off. So it destroyed the device and whoever was around it. And that. The toe popper's a little mine about that big around. It's designed to blow your leg off from the knee down, or whatever part's in the way. So we got a lot of good intel. It was a technique. Sometimes it worked, sometimes you couldn't use them. Depends on who the unit was in the area. You have to understand, our tactics were constantly evolving, because they get on top of you in a minute. In the latter part of the war in 71, 72, they started using anti-recon teams. And these boys were no sloughs. They were seasoned, experienced troops, mostly NCOs, and seasoned troops. And they'd use their green troops to take casualties and figure out where you were at, and then they'd send the anti-recon people in, and they'd drive you into an area where they could kill you, where you had no more terrain, or the weather started socking in, because our lifeline was air essence. As much as everybody liked to think they were giants of the battlefield, the aviation guys saved our cookies many, many times. Hope that answered the question.
I was very excited last night when I saw online that you were speaking. I was actually talking with my dad over the weekend. He served in 5th Special Forces. He was at Da Nang during the Tet, and he was at CCM at late 69 to early 70.
What's your last name?
Grissom. His name was Wayne Marvin Grissom. He was a captain.
Well, yeah, first of all,
Yeah.
captains are spec 4s with manners.
Yeah.
But
I'll make sure he knows you said that.
he'll
No.
understand, because my brother-in-law is a captain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The question I had for you, though, had to deal with, in the beginning of your talk, you mentioned the book about being a cathartic experience for you. And I know for several veterans, including my dad, coming back home wasn't the best. You didn't really have the support that you did for the other wars. So could you talk a little bit more about that cathartic experience, and maybe how other veterans who maybe not have the gift of writing about their ordeal, but other ways to express, because he never talked about any battles, any experiences he had. And I feel that part of that was maybe because some of it was classified, but some of it was that he just felt like it was going to be too emotional. So could you talk a little bit about that cathartic experience for you?
My best friend, by the way, your father was there in 71?
He was at CCM late 69, early 70.
Yeah. I think he was with the Hatchet Force in the beginning. I remember it, Captain Grissom, from that time period. My 1-0 has never read my book. The guy who's mostly about Minimac, Gator Breath. I know what bothers him, and that incident I've not written about. But, it brings back too many bad memories for him. But we have a reunion every year in Las Vegas. It's called Special Operations Association. And it's, and we're getting older, so there's less of us today from that era. But it's healing for us to get together and drink a hotel out of their Drambuie supply and scotch at the same time, and let it out. Because the only people that are going to understand you is another veteran, really. When you get right down to it, much as the family and everybody else would like to empathize and sympathize with the veteran, the only guy that really understands you is somebody that's been there and seen the elephant. Because war is it leaves an ugly scar on your soul. And don't get me wrong, because if you ask anybody, they're going to tell you, I'm not a liberal or a pacifist. I still have the same spirit in me that I went to Vietnam with. But I realized, and your dad realized, that things we did then, were part of war, and it shapes you, it affects you. The guys that I worked a lot with the new special forces in a number of areas. I've invented armor products, and I had a device that you could find a beating human heart under 55 foot of rubble, and they used it to find high-value targets in Iraq that were hiding between the walls and that, as a test, anyway. I couldn't be prouder of these guys if they were my own children. Totally, they have the same spirit, the same guts, they're having the same experiences that we had with dealing with PTSD and the other things that come with doing this type of a job. The government and the American people still haven't gotten their arms around what a tremendous debt they owe their veterans. That when I look around, I might be opinionated, but I think that the people in this country should get down on their knees and thank God that they're able to produce men like this, and women, that will go out there and do this for the country. So I'd say Vietnam shaped me because when I later got in the private sector, that don't give up has done me well over the years. I mean, don't get me wrong, I've had bankruptcies and things like that, but I never quit. And I think that's the one thing you come away with. Don't stop. Don't stop fighting. The minute you stop fighting, you're dead. Yeah.
I want to do another follow-up here. In the 1980s, we saw a lot of movies, Uncommon Valor, Rambo, Chuck Norris, and they were all about bringing prisoners home. And Hanoi Hilton, I believe there were attempts, but nobody ever escaped, and it's not clear whether there were ever any attempts to try to get them out. I'm just curious in regards to what you were involved with, if there were plans of trying to find folks, bring them home, things that happened in Iran in regards to the hostages. We obviously know the history there in regards to attempts to try to bring people and recover. Anything that you can describe in regards to missions like that existed from that perspective?
We tried to do prisoner recoveries when we could find out about it. We did a number of things. I mean, there was a team of deserters from the United States Army that they called Salt and Pepper. One black guy, one white guy that was working with the North Vietnamese. They were high on that prisoner snatch list. If you ran across them, get them back, because they wanted to have a question and answer period with them. The Tailwind was an example of a mission that went really bad when because it had all the potential to be bad in the first place. Trying to get, and I don't know if anybody here remembers the Tailwind debacle where they accused special forces of all kinds of atrocities and trying to rescue prisoners in South Vietnam. And I think that stain against our honor is why we tried so hard to get the hostages out of Iran. That it had come to an impasse that, I mean, dealing with the Persians should be, I don't know, it's an exercise in futility because they really are a true Janus. What they're saying out of one side is not what they mean out of the other. So they'd actually come to the decision they had to do something with it militarily. All the assets were there. All the proper tools were there. And luck just wasn't. Because to be successful on the battlefield, you have to have skill and luck on the same day. Can't have one and not the other. So there were a lot of failed attempts on, privately, after the war. There was a number of groups that went back in there, guys from Special Forces that went back trying to recover people that they thought were, we had an excellent intel network in the Montagnards and the Laotians and the people we worked with, that they were feeding information to us. One case in particular, Colonel Bob Howard, who was a former Sergeant First Class, rulers of the world, and he was the most decorated veteran of Vietnam. He had a Medal of Honor. He'd been put in for the Medal of Honor twice. Had a Medal of Honor, I think 2 DSCs, a bunch of Silver Stars. Hardcore West Virginia, let's go get him. That type of guy. He was in Vietnam in, I think, 78 with some official function in that. A Frenchman journalist came up to him and handed him a note that had been handed to him by somebody in the crowd. And it was signed, it said, "Don't forget me," and it was signed Tupelo Flash. The only guy that was known in special projects by that name was First Lieutenant Danny Entrican. And Danny Entrican disappeared when RT ASP, Recon Team ASP, got overrun. And we actually went in on, we had a thing we call Bright Light, which is essentially, you're so shot up, you can't get your wounded, and you're shot up, but to the helicopter. You call for help. And a Bright Light team comes in, shoots their way in, gathers you up, shoots their way back to the helicopters, and hopefully everybody gets out. So we had gone in on the Bright Light on this, and we had been listening on the radio at the time to I think it was Entrican that was talking on the radio, and a guy named Hollingsworth had been shot up pretty bad. And Daryl Denke was the other guy that was the other American on the team was already dead. And Entrican was staying with Hollingsworth, and Hollingsworth was really badly wounded. And then we heard rifle shots, and then nothing after that. When the Bright Light team got there, we found Hollingsworth. He'd been executed. And we found Denke, but we never found Entrican. But this note said, "Please don't forget me, Tupelo Flash." And there's only one person that could have written that note. So, and we're pretty sure that after the war there were still POWs that were there from us. And normally they didn't capture us. The word was in the bush was if they got you, they had instructions to execute you in a particularly nasty way as a way of improving the morale of the troops. So that meant being hung up as bayonet practice or whatever they could come up with. But none of our guys really survived. John Caviani came out of captivity, and he'd been captured up on Hickory. Totally different group. I mean, you're dealing with PAVN, not the local militias or anything like that. But I hope I answered your questions. I have a tendency to rattle on at times. There was a gentleman that was over here.
Couple questions for you. What inspired you to join? So you volunteered, and I'm assuming you were in Vietnam for 3 years or 4 years. I mean, so you stayed. Did you have to have a 3 or 4 year commitment? What was it like for special ops?
I was unlucky in love. Yeah, you enlisted, you had to be enlisted to get into Special Forces. And then as far as Special Ops, and like I said, you went there, you did your time, did the project, and then you went on to another project. So what made me stay, it was, Special Forces is the greatest job in the world. And being a Special Forces team sergeant is the best job in the world. You know, and anywhere in that 12-man team, because the things that you do and the missions they give you are so diverse and so challenging that I can't see how anybody wouldn't want to be in Special Forces. Hope I answered your question.
Yeah, you did. Thank you. Second question. So you just mentioned that the American public doesn't embrace, veterans the way they ought. What's your suggestion for the way the general public can do a better job of that? So I'm not a policymaker. I have one friend that served in Afghanistan, and but some of the time I feel like the American public doesn't know how. We stand up at ball games and whatever and clap, but I come here to listen to you because I respect what you've done and I'm grateful for it. But what's a way that, not at the government level, but the average citizen can do a better job of embracing or thanking veterans?
We're getting better at it. Let's put it that way, the American public is. And people come up and thank you all the time for your service and that. And I got to say, when I see veterans today, I buy them lunch or I buy them a beer, and try and show them that people out here think of them as what they are, heroes, for being on the line. Being in the shield wall, that's what it's all about. Best way to have the American public get more involved in it, I think, is the positive stories about veterans. I agree with the president that the press at times is their own worst enemy and our worst enemy. They really, it's slanted, let's put it that way. But we're getting better at it. I think that a lot more, we're becoming more open since I know people probably don't like the Donald being in office, but he's done a lot to change this country so far. Back to, I just can't believe that our country has gotten the way it is, because when I grew up, it was, Davy Crockett, and, you went off to war if you were called. If you were drafted, you went. If if your dad and your uncle both served in World War II, by God, you're going in the military. And it was an obligation. It wasn't described as, well, you're going to get caught, you're going to get drafted, you have to go to Vietnam. It was your sworn duty as a citizen that if your country called, you went. That's why they had the draft. And the drafted soldier is what we won 2 wars with. The National Guard, the activated battalions and that, the draftees that came in, filled up our ranks in that, and actually went out there and destroyed Germany and the Axis powers. So, and Vietnam. We fought Vietnam with draftees. We fought Vietnam with McNamara's 100,000, which was a program so that even the mentally disabled could die for their country. They drafted people of exceptionally low IQs, basically, in McNamara's 100,000, and not in the main, but in some, as a way of filling up the troop levies, which I thought was an insult to the people that they actually drafted. But they did fight. They honored themselves by their performance. Any other questions? Yeah, okay. One more? Or? By the way, go ahead.
Sorry, I was in the Special Forces also, but I was in there a little earlier than you were. I got out to 68, but I'm saying things have changed a bit since I was in the Special Forces also. And one thing about it, the Mountain Guards, they hated the Vietnamese.
Oh,
yeah. That's,
and vice versa.
yeah, that's one of the things that really made them good soldiers, because they really hated the Vietnamese.
Oh, yeah.
They hated them with a passion. And like I'm saying is that, when there was a part of volunteering. You had to volunteer to go to jump school, and then they gave you a test. And I remember taking the test. They actually gave us a physical test to get into Special Forces. And after we got in there, it was like you said, it was like heaven. There was no place else like it. It was really a great bunch of guys, a great bunch of things, and we did a lot of great things. Like one of the things we did, they sent us down to South America, and we were supposed to, it was a Dominican Republic. They sent us down to the Dominican Republic.
Tom Rupp.
And we was down there, and we were supposed to get the people on our side. So the first thing we did was dressed up like bandits, robbed the bank, and paid all the people. And they turned in all the bad guys. But that's some of the things that Special Forces did.
That sounds like a good Special Forces operation. You know, I actually wrote a book one time with another fellow called Financial Operations in the Unconventional Warfare Theater. And what it was bank robbery manual. We actually met some guys that were professional bank robbers that we went to prison and talked to them and got tips, and that was, you know, how do you finance a guerrilla organization? You rob banks and rob trains and that. As soon as we got done with it, they classified it to the ceiling, and they confiscated they physically searched us for any notes we might have had at the time and that. So, yeah, it's a wonderful group, and proud to have served with you.
A lot, really.
So, thank you.